Thanks everybody for taking the time to come to this webinar on using socioeconomic indicators to understand the implications of base realignment and closure, or BRAC. You might have registered for this under the name Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Impacts, but we are going to be looking at some socioeconomic indicators and referring to those. But that's pretty interchangeable with the concept of DEI. So hopefully that prevents confusion later on. I'll go ahead and give us a roadmap of the webinar today. We'll start off with an introduction of REMI, of who we are, what we do, and then an introduction of the topic itself. Go over some of the definitions, the history, the current challenges facing BRAC and those types of issues. We'll look at a collection of case studies, specifically in Texas and South Carolina. Then we'll discuss some potential impacts of a hypothetical future round of BRAC on a particular base, and then jump into a live model demo where we can look at some of these socioeconomic indicators and better understand how BRAC affects different demographic, income, educational levels within a regional economy. So also at the end, we'll have time for a question and answer session. So as we go along, please feel free to take notes or hold on to any questions that come up, as you'll have the opportunity to ask those at the end. So about us, we are Regional Economic Models Incorporated. We are the nation's leader in dynamic local, state, and national policy modeling. We were created over 40 years ago with the single goal of improving public policies through data-driven analysis. So that's who we are. A little more background on our goal and our work. We build customizable regional models for a number of clients. As you can see here at the bottom, there's a few logos of some very small sampling of some of our clients that we've worked with on varying issues. But I hope this just at least gives you an idea of the breadth and depth of work that REMI is involved in at all stages of the policy process. And with that, I think we are ready to jump into the topic introduction so that we can actually sort of get an idea of where we'll go from here, as it concerns BRAC. So economic impacts of BRAC, the key question there is, what does BRAC mean for a regional economy? Broken this out into 4 major areas. So of course, regional economic development is a core concern for BRAC, as military bases are central hubs of economic activity. So BRAC necessitates a new long-term approach, a new long-term plan for a regional economy and for their economic development initiatives, so as to attract new businesses, new commercial activity, new housing, basically to come in and fill the gaps that potential closure or contraction or even restructuring of a base could cause to a region. Population shifts are also a major part of the economic impacts of BRAC. So the demographic makeup of a region inevitably changes in very stark ways because of BRAC. So military service members, if a base was to close, military service members and their dependents may relocate, be assigned elsewhere, or if they stay within the region, they likely, change some of their roles, maybe change where they work, take on different forms of employment. Also, with a new, a new economic landscape in the region, new migrants may be attracted to the changing economic conditions in the area. So that can also really shift that makeup of the community. Of course, labor market changes go right along with this population shift phenomenon. Labor supply and demand must find new equilibria as different skills come into demand, as different sectors see growth and losses, and the types of employment available and the compensation available in different types of employment. As those things change, basically the entire labor market can shift in really distinct ways. And then finally, the socioeconomic indicators. This piece of the impact of BRAC is very important in that the impacts of a base closing, restructuring, expanding, contracting, and new regional economic development changes, all of these can mean very different things for different groups, different socioeconomic groups. And so broad-based economic prosperity after BRAC requires carefully examining how the economic impacts of BRAC impact different racial, ethnic, gender, and income groups differently. So with that, to bring the topic back to REMI and economic modeling, I think the key question asked here is how can economic modeling, how can the REMI model be used to understand and plan for the long and short-term impacts of BRAC? And what socioeconomic metrics can economic modeling offer during this planning process? So REMI has a background in doing this type of work. So we've worked with, on the Letterkenny, Army Depot, and Franklin County base closure, did an economic impact study at this university, worked with the Senate Committee on Veteran Affairs and Military Installations in the state of Texas. Also worked with the Maine State Planning Office on closing a Naval Air Station in Brunswick, and worked with North Carolina General Assembly on understanding the entire impact of the military on their state. So this is a small sampling of past BRAC and military-based studies that REMI's done. Past work that shows how data-driven economic impact analysis can inform successful planning, can help policymakers and decision makers really understand, not only the demographic and the macroeconomic shifts that happen as a result of big changes like this, but also the socioeconomic metrics and implications of BRAC and of military base changes. So with that, I think we can go ahead and move on to the case studies piece of the presentation. First, to provide a little bit of context on BRAC, in case you aren't super familiar with the concept. Base realignment and closure is the congressionally authorized process that DoD has used to primarily reorganize its base structure to improve efficiency and efficacy. So that means, shutting down military installments that are not operating at full capacity, cutting costs where possible. BRAC's also used to increase operational readiness for the military and to facilitate new ways of doing business in a region. So bringing in different kinds of commercial activity when that military base is going out and jobs are being lost, but then, finding new ways to create economic prosperity. So those are really the key purposes of BRAC. In the past, there have been more than 350 installations closed in BRAC rounds. And some past rounds, fairly, maybe not recently now, but some past rounds within the past 4 decades include rounds in 1988, 1991, 1995, and 2005. And collectively, each of these rounds together have contributed to a combined savings of $12 billion annually. And then currently, between all 50 US states, DC, and US territories, the DoD oversees more than 420 military installations, not including the US military bases overseas. But essentially, BRAC is a massive policy undertaking with pretty complex, large goals with a lot of money at stake and a lot of lives and jobs and regional identities being affected. So definitely something that's important and that's had massive effects throughout the past few rounds. So in summary, in both the historical and current context, BRAC aims to improve military efficiency without unduly hurting affected regional economies. So some other reasons why BRAC, some reasons would include efficiency improvements. So as I mentioned, reducing excess military infrastructure and closing installations that are operating significantly below capacity. Saving billions of dollars a year by increasing efficiency. BRAC is also important because it allows for new defense strategies. So allowing military leaders to evaluate military installations based on new criteria, what the US was thinking about and needing from the military point of view, like in the post-Cold War era, might look somewhat different than in 2005, and of course from 2005 to now, even more different how to define what military value means and what the goals are of the military. So BRAC allows for that reevaluation and redefinition of military value so that that type of value is being maximized. Of course, political motivations, that's another reason for BRAC. Recently, this has come back sort of into the public discourse as the new Deputy Secretary of Defense, as of February of this year, advocated for a new round of BRAC, pointing to some of the benefits of efficiency improvements and saving money. So there's always that going on too in the background. And then finally, the new national needs of the United States is another great reason for why BRAC is is a tool, is being talked about. So new needs necessitate new planning, new strategies. So provides the opportunity to reevaluate US military installations, understand how economic and policy environments have shifted over time, and to plan to bring new commercial activity to struggling regions. So the tie-in with socio-economic indicators is pretty clear when we think about this simple question: how does BRAC affect different income and demographic groups differently? There are major regional demographic changes and major regional economic changes. So as I alluded to earlier, population changes, this involves active military and their dependents, K through 12 school population, base staff, so military staff, but also federal civilian staff, types of employment, labor force makeup. All of these come into greater flux when BRAC happens. Availability of resources can change in the sense that housing, military housing, food access, and healthcare all may be taken away from that area, and so that availability of resources sort of comes into question and might be a little bit destabilized. And then of course BRAC causes really large-scale economic changes for a local economy or regional economy. So local governments' funding sources and the provision of services that they're able to fund and provide effectively, that can be greatly impacted. Military budget adjustments, of course, really change the economic makeup of the region. And then employment opportunities and access to jobs and different skill sets are all changed up as a result of BRAC. So different employment opportunities become available, other ones go away, and then different types of skills come into demand. So pretty disruptive and transformative thing for a community. Two particular case studies. These are both from the 1991 round of BRAC. Two that I have presented here. One is the Air Force Base that was in Austin, Texas, and I chose this one as a case study in that this Air Force Base was converted into the Austin Bergstrom International Airport. And even this process of going from an Air Force Base to an international airport over the decades, had some SEI implications in that noise pollution and other concerns, were affecting low-income communities or low-income housing subdivisions that were in the flight path of the previous municipal airport and had an interest in having, an airport moved to where the Air Force Base was. So after BRAC, the city took over the land and developed the international airport there. So that's an interesting case study in closing a base and then converting it into an international airport and undertaking redevelopment in an intentional way so that now that area looks a lot different but is also experiencing economic prosperity in general. There's also Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, the Myrtle Beach Air Force Base that was closed in 1993, similar to the Austin base in that it was in the midst of military cutbacks after the Cold War. So redevelopment in Myrtle Beach included a wider variety of things, I would say, than the Austin redevelopment effort. So the Air Force Base in Myrtle Beach turned into a technical college, parks, recreation facilities, golf course, an urban village commercial center, so like a new hub for retail and restaurants, and also a construction of a research and development center for electronics manufacturing. So tourism and some of the building booms happening after the Air Force Base closure helped offset some losses, although losses still occurred, and there were still certainly challenges over the redevelopment plan for Myrtle Beach. And of course, a big concern too for BRAC is the environmental implications of a military base on the surrounding environment. But essentially, these two case studies from the 1990s show us sort of the variety of redevelopment efforts that have succeeded post-BRAC, and I guess essentially how like a city's character and layout and economy can really restructure in the wake of BRAC. So with all of that sort of setting the stage, I think we're ready to get to our model demo. Just to set up the demo that I want to walk us through today, I wanted to do a hypothetical new round. So presuming that there were to be a hypothetical new round of base closures and economic redevelopment in the next year or so. I just took some estimates based on the Fort Jackson base in Columbia, South Carolina, and implemented the changes in Richland County, South Carolina. Fort Jackson base is not, currently slated for BRAC, but in the last round, there was certainly anxiety in the state that it could be. There's always anxiety that the bases could be listed and that could cause, unwanted effects. So, at the time in 2005, when that list was released, military bases as a whole in South Carolina contributed around $7 billion to the state economy and 142,000 jobs. So, with the, specter of BRAC on the horizon, a lot of advocacy and lobbying groups by communities around these bases, as well as local politicians and other interested parties, all were deeply invested in keeping Fort Jackson open. And of course, the base was not affected by the latest round of BRAC, but the question that I'm going to get into a little bit here with my model simulation is, what might the economic impacts of a potential restructuring, contraction, or closure be on the surrounding regional economy? So just taking the hypothetical closure of Fort Jackson and a few hypothetical economic redevelopment efforts that that were informed by the real redevelopment efforts from the past closure in Myrtle Beach, taking both of those as sort of sources and jumping off points for this hypothetical simulation. I'm hoping to reveal some of the socioeconomic indicators that within the model can help, were another round of BRAC to come up again. I hope that this demo can at least show some of the capabilities of the REMI model in estimating economic impacts, in revealing socioeconomic indicators, and in offering, long and short-term perspective on planning for effective redevelopment post-BRAC. So with that, I will be using a REMIPI Plus model with the socioeconomic indicators feature enabled. So PI Plus is our flagship model, and we specialize in generating accurate year-by-year estimates of total local, state, and national effects of any specific policy initiative. Over to the right is a model diagram showing from a high-level overview what the model linkages are within the model. So I'll go ahead and show you some of those pieces working together in an actual simulation. Okay, so here is the REMIPI Plus model that I have for the simulation today. It's a South Carolina 46 region model. It includes all the counties within the state. 70 sector model, so that describes the level of industry detail that we can get into with this particular model. And as you can see, the landing page here, if you're unfamiliar with our models, this is the general landing page for all REMI models with a user-friendly tiled interface. Boxes here at the bottom to see the baseline forecasts, which are the baseline from which all of our simulations are calculated. So were there to be no economic shock, were there to be no policy or project implemented, what would that baseline forecast look like? And you can click here to see what those assumptions are. You can set new controls at both the regional and the national level to see how, if the regional forecast and the national forecast at the baseline, aren't quite the control you want to run against, then you can create your own. And then, of course, run your own simulations up here in the new national and the new regional simulation box. So I've already prepared a new regional simulation, which I'll be running against the standard regional control. Excuse me. So here, this page is our policy variable selection page, and I've brought it up to this piece where you can see our scenario modules that are pre-built into the model. And as you can see, one of our first modules pre-built here for ease of use is the base realignment and closure module. So I've used several variables from this feature to prepare the demo. I'll just quickly show you these BRAC related variables within the model. So as you can see, we have policy variables relating to that federal military and federal civilian government employment. You can also change industry employment as that changes, during the BRAC process. You can also capture compensation. And then in expenditures, you can look at exogenous final demand, investment spending, detailed investment, and then of course those key demographic variables that I mentioned a bit earlier in the webinar, those demographic shifts as a result of BRAC, so really affecting active military and military dependents. So this is just the BRAC module, which gives you some of our most relevant policy variables to model BRAC scenarios, although we do have many more policy variables that capture other pieces of the macroeconomic landscape. So I've used a few others in my in the scenario I prepared today. So with that, I'll show you my inputs list here so you can understand what we'll see in the results. First of all, I included a policy variable input to capture some of the redevelopment efforts post this hypothetical closure in Richland County, South Carolina. This was informed too by the past efforts in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So just, presuming that were Fort Jackson to close, the redevelopment might look similar to some of the efforts that, say, Horry County and Myrtle Beach undertook. So here I've adjusted industry employment over the later part of a time horizon. I have the base closing in 2021, and so those effects really coming into place that we'll see here in the first couple years, and then increases in the industries that would be more affected by redevelopment efforts. Under this piece, I have military government employment loss of those jobs. So after closure, that loss of active federal military employment. So I have the bulk of that happening in the early years of the forecast. I've also input the effects of closure on the military dependents. And then the final two pieces of the simulation include loss of federal civilian employment and some of the military dependent demographic shifts as well. So those are our inputs going into the simulation. And now we can look at a few results to understand how economic modeling can be used in planning for and evaluating potential effects of BRAC. So first of all, this page that we've come to is our economic summary page. So this gives us a good macroeconomic overview of the conditions as a result of those inputs that I showed you that I just put in the model, and run against the comparison forecast to standard regional control. So of course, initially we see some pretty devastating losses in employment during those years when the base first closes, as we might expect. So the first 3 years are some pretty dramatic losses as a result of this hypothetical base closure. But as we see those redevelopment efforts ramp up, new economic migrants, new types of jobs, growth in new sectors, specifically service, retail, hospitality, like food, food service, and other industries related to that area. That growth in those sectors is really captured in increases that we begin to see towards the end of our time horizon. You can also see how our population is impacted. With those big demographic shifts, we're seeing a pretty consistently negative impact on the population in the region. And for clarity too, I'm looking specifically at Richland County, which is the county of interest where Fort Jackson base is actually located. So that's why I focused in on this particular county within the state as a whole. We see our labor force declining at first, and then eventually beginning to pick up a bit towards the end as these redevelopment efforts and growth in other sectors begin to come into effect. We can see the impact on GDP as well, and output. So big losses again at the very beginning of the time horizon when the base would first be closing, and then slowly recovering as the redevelopment efforts get underway. You can see the effects on personal income as well. And just overall, I think this table helps give a sort of a summary, high-level overview of what's going on in the county as a result. But to get into a little bit more detail, I will show you this demographics tab to show just how some of these changes are happening across the state. So again, the county that I implemented the changes in is Richland County. So this is where we see, of course, the largest impacts year by year in that loss of population. We can also view by race, gender, and age specifically how that population is shifting. And then, of course, with all of the counties in the model here, we can see how they are also being, they're experiencing these ripple effects too across the state. Although to a lesser degree, we'll see like some of the closer counties to Richland, like Lexington County, is also being hit harder and losing population as a result. Take us to labor force components, so we can see some of those changes that I mentioned being something we might expect earlier in the webinar. So see some losses in that labor force population and participation rates. And again, you can see by race, gender, and age. But with that, I think we can get into our socioeconomic indicators to really better understand that part of the BRAC impact. So to get started on these indicators, we'll begin with our compensation distribution series of features. First of all, we can see this compensation rate by industry quintile graph. So this shows us the industry quintiles, broken up based on their average annual compensation rates, and then how it's being impacted by the inputs I put in. So initially, we see pretty big losses in that compensation rate for all industries, most notably for the second 20%. And by the year 2023, in the lowest 20% as well, although there's pretty high losses across all quintiles for those first few years of the base closure. So this is really capturing a lot of those losses in the federal military and federal civilian employment. But the rest of the time horizon, we can see some recovery beginning to happen with the second 20%. And as we go on, we see some increases for the middle quintiles as well as the highest quintile by the end. So we can also see this as weighted compensation rate, which will be weighted by baseline employment. Might be a little bit easier to interpret for these later years what's going on. So with average annual compensation rate weighted by baseline employment, we can see the increases in the lowest quintile and the second lowest quintile really experiencing the greatest growth during the redevelopment efforts. And I think this is intuitive when you think about it, because those retail service jobs, tourism related jobs, all of those industries are captured within these quintiles. So to see the jump in that compensation rate there kind of makes sense, considering the redevelopment efforts that I assumed might be implemented based on what Myrtle Beach did in the 90s. We can further, I think we kind of covered compensation here, so I'll go ahead and take us to the inequality coefficient, which is a measure of compensation rate inequality across all of our regions of interest. So specifically, we can look at Richland, as this is the location of the base. And as you can see, there's an increase over our full time horizon in this number. So essentially, this is a Gini type coefficient, and the increase shows an increase in inequality. So meaning that the lowest wage earner and the highest wage earner in the county are becoming further apart. So that inequality coefficient is getting more positive. Next, we can look at employment by income level. So that was our compensation distribution, but now we can also see employment. So again, within these first few years, we see those drops in employment as we would expect during that closure. And then the increases during the recovery that are really going to those sectors benefiting, when the sectors chosen in the redevelopment efforts are really focusing on that retail and those service industries. By occupation quintile, we can also see the occupations that are seeing the greatest gains in employment. So the lowest 20% of occupations is really where the biggest growth in employment is post base closure. And interestingly, here you can see the biggest loss in the base closure is from this higher occupation quintile, so the fourth quintile. So we're seeing, a loss of these higher paying jobs for a gain in the lower paying jobs. Looking at both of these graphs together. Prices by income level. So this here is a measure of the impact of consumption prices on different income quintiles. So we can look by income quintile or by income range. And here we'll see how these different quintiles are, affected by changes in consumer price. So it's a pretty effective measure of how consumers are reacting to inflation. But moving along, I think an important piece of this picture is the employment by demographics feature. So using American Community Survey data, we have these 4 racial and ethnic categories. And with these categories, we can understand where the losses and the gains in employment are happening on this racial and ethnic basis. So when the base closes, we see the largest losses for the white non-Hispanic group, although there are pretty significant losses across our other groups here too. And then as we look towards the end of our time horizon with these redevelopment efforts in effect, we're seeing, interestingly, the largest gains in employment for the Hispanic group in Richland County. Also some significant gains for the other non-Hispanic group. And as we get a little bit longer or further into our time horizon, we can see some modest gains as well for the Black non-Hispanic group. So seeing that shift in, seeing those demographic shifts and seeing that demographic shift in employment as well as a result of BRAC. We can see by gender as well. So initially, some pretty big losses in employment to male populations, although pretty significant also for the female populations. And then as the recovery happens, we see more equal levels of employment, although lower overall towards the end of the time horizon. Labor force participation, so this is going to look pretty similar to the employment by demographics graph, but of course we'll be measuring participation rate rather than employment. But using the same demographic categories, we can see that labor force participation most dramatically dropped in the beginning for the white non-Hispanic and the other non-Hispanic groups. And then towards the end of towards the midpoint and the end, we can see the participation rates rising for the white non-Hispanic group, the other non-Hispanic group, and a little bit later on more for the Black non-Hispanic group. And by gender too, we can see how labor force participation rates were affected by gender too. So initially, we see more male populations leaving the labor force when the base closes, and then slightly more male participation relative to female participation, even in the years of the redevelopment. And finally, the last 2 pieces of these socioeconomic indicators that I'd like to show today is the unemployment measure and the per capita income measure. So as you can see across all regions within the model, so all counties in the state of South Carolina, we see that in total, when the base closed in that one county, unemployment for the state rose within those first couple years and then began to drop overall. But within our county of interest here, we can see that unemployment hit pretty hard at first, and then did begin to recover over our time horizon. I'll highlight that for ease of view. And then finally, per capita income shows us across, well, and we can see for all regions, but looking specifically at our county of interest, we can see those changes in personal income, disposable personal income, and real disposable personal income over time. So I think that some of the interesting conclusions that we can draw based on this hypothetical closure of Fort Jackson, alongside these hypothetical redevelopment efforts that focus really on increasing tourism, retail, service industry, all those types of jobs like they did in Myrtle Beach. I think that we see pretty interestingly how different income quintiles are affected. So we saw the higher quintiles being hurt more at the beginning when the base was closed, and we see the lower income quintiles gaining more in the years of the redevelopment. We also saw employment by demographics. We saw a pretty important shift there from employment, loss of employment in the military among those groups versus in the redevelopment period. And with that, I think I will take us back to the webinar so that we still have time for a Q&A session. So I will share this screen again and take us home. So I think after the model simulation, I hope this question is easier to answer. Why does economic modeling modeling matter? It matters because it helps clarify the economic, physical, and demographic implications of policies before they're implemented. So were there to be another round of BRAC, the capabilities of a model like REMI are very useful in understanding and planning ahead what those impacts are going to be, and to help ensure that public policy, redevelopment efforts, et cetera, are serving all parts of the public, all groups, regardless of socioeconomic status. Economic modeling helps us predict the effects of policies, avoid unwanted negative impacts, and make more effective use of resources. And of course, using these, the understanding that comes from economic modeling and the data that comes from economic modeling, this can really help tell a story to stakeholders, to politicians, to community members, so that moving forward, what's best for the community is what's put forward. Briefly, a map showing the breadth and depth of studies that REMI has done in the past. Of course, this was a focus on military bases and military issues, but we do work across all topic areas, all policy topic areas, and of course, we're more than happy to talk to you about any of the different areas that we work on. But with that, I would like to turn it over to Dee to guide us through our Q&A session. So thank you.